Sure. Whoever line up against us, they're going to get all of it. They don't pause, but they're going to get everything we bring to the table.
And late this afternoon, a blow to the Ravens' offensive line. All-pro tackle Ronnie Stanley, it was announced, is out for the year. Kickoff is set for 1 p.m. The point spread remains Ravens minus 6.5. The odds makers are saying the Ravens are a touchdown better than the Bengals. We'll see. From M&T Bank Stadium, I'm Bruce Cunningham, Fox 45 News.
And a quick look at your weekend forecast. If you're going to be going and checking out, the leaves are just changing here in Baltimore. The farther west you get, the closer to peak you're going to get. Our peak here in Baltimore sometime right around Halloween time. Now, if you're going to be hitting the pumpkin patch on Saturday, temperatures start in the 50s, working up into the 60s. There could be a few showers around as well. And then the Ravens game on Sunday looking great. Temperatures in the 60s and dry with pleasant sunshine there. Guys?
Thank you, Jonathan. This is a live look right now. We're moments away from our next Your Voice, Your Future town hall.
I'm Dan Miller.
I'm Kevin Stern. At Miller Stern Lawyers, we are honored to serve the community that we love. We work for you.
For over a decade, we've spent our days and nights fighting for you. We believe in justice. We believe in fighting for what's right.
That's why we are proud to sponsor a community conversation to make a better Baltimore.
It takes guts to stand up for justice and accountability and demand better.
And we can do it by giving you a voice in your future.
At Miller Stern, we're fighting for a better Baltimore.
Charm City. Neighborhoods full of history, great people, and lots of potential. A city trying to clean up its act after years of decay. A place where children should be safe to play on clean streets. But the pockets of problems are growing. Grime and crime make for bad neighbors. And now, even the once pristine parts of our wonderful city are in the fight of their lives to stop a city plagued by crime, grime, corruption, and failing schools. From Fox 45 News, this is a Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall, the Save Our City Tour. Neighbors helping neighbors, council district by council district.
Welcome to City Hall. Earlier this afternoon, we invited all of our leaders several days ago, and earlier this afternoon, we tried one more time to get them to participate in tonight's discussion. We went to City Hall, tried to invite Mayor Brandon Scott, City Council President Nick Mosby, and all of the other City Council members. We were told it wasn't clear if the City Council members were inside City Hall, and Mayor Scott's team told us we could reach out to their communications team to extend the invitation, of which we have already done. And tonight, no elected leaders are choosing to participate. Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Mackenzie Frost. We're live outside City Hall for our 8th installment of our Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. We're about halfway through making our way all across Baltimore, holding these events in each city council district, listening to constituents' concerns, and trying to find solutions to some of Baltimore's biggest problems. Again, we invited Mayor Brandon Scott, City Council President Nick Mosby, all of the other city council members, as well as city school leaders. All have refused to participate, but we still have a panel. Let me introduce you to those who have chosen to participate in tonight's discussion. First up, we have Pastor Shannon Wright. She's an education advocate and former Baltimore City mayoral candidate. We have Tharu Vignaraja, former federal prosecutor and former Baltimore City mayoral candidate as well. Next, we have Kimberly Klasick. She is a former congressional candidate running in the 7th Congressional District. And finally, we have Claudia Tolles, who is running to replace Zeke Cohen in the 1st Baltimore City Council District, a small business owner and a realtor. Panelists, thank you so much for participating. I look forward to our discussion tonight. We have a lot to get to. Let's dive right in. First of all, like I mentioned, we have no elected leaders at this town hall tonight, this discussion that continues to go on despite the leaders refusing to participate in this as well as our other events. But you all are here. We have plenty of people in our audience who are here to participate and voice their concerns. My first question to all of you, I want to start with Tharu, but tonight I want to get everyone to weigh in. Why do you think these leaders are not coming tonight? And what message does it send? We made it as easy as possible, bringing this event right to their door at City Hall, and yet they're still not here.
I wish they appreciated how disrespectful it is to all of you to not show up. If this town hall was being held next to their mother or father's house, next to their grandmother or grandfather's house, because their grandmothers and grandparents were worried about what was happening outside their home, would they really dare to not show up? Well, they don't have, apparently, the same respect for all of you that they have for themselves. They're not too busy. This isn't an accident. This isn't a scheduling conflict. This is a conscious, deliberate choice that they make over and over again, that they can count you out. They insult your intelligence. They assume no one's paying attention, and they think once election time comes around, they'd rather spend their time with donors and developers than with the citizens and constituents.
Kimberly Klasick, I want to get you to weigh in on this because you ran for Congress, but working with local leaders is part of that job as well. Does it send a message in your mind that these leaders are not here to listen and participate in this conversation?
Well, I don't think it's surprising. I think this is what they choose to do all of the time. They never want to answer the real tough questions. I've seen yourself and many others asking these questions, and they kind of just shove it off. But at the end of the day, we are here. Like you said, we're right in front of City Hall, and they could be here, but they're not. Like Tharu was saying, they care a lot about donors and developers. And I think when you look at the neighborhoods and the residents that they ignore, it is those residents that maybe can't afford to donate that big money, maybe residents that are not going to be developers in this city. And so they continue to ignore and neglect those people. And at some point in time, I think voters are getting sick and tired of it, and they're going to make a change, and I hope it's now.
I want to bring that up, but first, Claudia, I want to get your take on this because you're already running for city council, which the election is several years away from now. But why do you think it's important to start laying the groundwork, especially in a district held by Zeke Cohen, who is known in the city and in his district?
Look, I'm not a politician. I guess I am because I'm running for office, but that is not my career of choice. I am here because, just like many of you, I am tired of being ignored. I am tired of not having a representative who represents the interests of an entire district. We are a very diverse city. We're a very diverse district, and we can't have folks who selectively engage with their constituents because whether they believe or disagree or don't understand, there's no way to do that, understand, unless you're participating, unless you're showing up. And they're not showing up. Zeke Cohen has been invited many times and refuses to show up. I'm here because I need to reach out to constituents. I need people to know that they have someone who wants to pay attention, who's ready to do the hard work, and that's why I've announced so far ahead in advance.
Pastor Wright, I know that you ran for mayor, but you're also an education advocate, and we invited City Schools CEO Dr. Sonia Santelises, as well as the entire School Board of Commissioners. We've talked about these school problems. We know that Project Baltimore has investigated city schools for years. We know that we're just scratching the surface with some of the problems that we've uncovered with those investigations. Do you think it sends a message to the city that those school leaders also have chosen not to participate tonight?
Absolutely it does. They are where their priority is, which is not here. They are with their priority, which is making sure their children are in private schools. They are with their priority of their homes outside of this city. So until the folks in this city, you know, we can get as mad as we want at the elected folks, but until the voters in this city decide that they want to value their vote, meaning give their vote to someone that actually respects them. Kind of like you're a parent. When you teach your children, when you start to date, you want somebody that respects you, someone that values you. So how long are the voters in this city going to allow themselves to stay in an abusive relationship?
Is that how you would describe this current leadership?
Absolutely. What else would you call it? When you're in a relationship with someone, you give them what they need and they give you nothing. They go to the bathroom on you and hope that you forget it when it's time to vote for them again. What would you call it? That's an abusive relationship.
Yes. And speaking of when it's time to run for re-election again, we just had an election, obviously, last year. But do you think that the city, I know that I've talked to several people who have voted for Mayor Brandon Scott over especially this summer when I was out talking to people across the city in various communities, and they we're frustrated with what he's doing right now. Do you think that that is a common feeling amongst other people in Baltimore City? Are they sort of having some buyer's remorse?
Well, I would think you would have to. If you look at the rhetoric of how soon you want to see reduction in crime that's still increasing, if you look at the rhetoric of how much you want to improve schools that are still declining, if you look at the rhetoric of how we're going to improve and turn the economic climate around, yet businesses are leaving, jobs are leaving, and the population is declining, how could you not have buyer's remorse? You know, I can't speak for anybody else, but I would imagine most of the folks that ran for mayor in the last cycle,
the sounds of the city.
That most of us have enough going on in our lives that it wasn't an ego trip. It was because we actually wanted to see change in the city, because we understood what it meant to have real leadership in the city. See, real leadership isn't the kind that's out playing kickball when the cameras are around. Real leadership is the one that's sitting in City Hall late at night trying to figure out how to make ends meet, how to actually get the streets safer, how to actually enact economic policies that attract companies to the city instead of sending them running from the city.
Drew, I want to bring you in because when you mentioned the mayor's crime plan, and we know that obviously our homicide rate is continuing it's on pace to surpass 300 for the 7th year in a row. The crimes continue to happen. Just last week, the Baltimore Police Department announced that a 16-year-old boy was arrested and charged with first-degree murder after the death of another teenager earlier this summer. Do you think the mayor's crime plan is really equipped to handle the level of violence that is impacting Baltimore and has been impacting Baltimore for years?
You don't need me to evaluate that crime plan. The number speaks for itself. We have exactly the same pace of violence in Baltimore City this year that we did last year, as we did the year before that. Whether Brandon Scott has been the chair of public safety and the council, whether he's been council president, whether he's been mayor, he's been in a lot of different seats, but the results are the same. But this isn't supposed to be political. The election has happened. I think the reason it's important for us to show up is because we need to have this conversation relentlessly. They often say that vigilance is the price of democracy. You don't just have an election and then go away for 4 years. It's tempting. We all have other responsibilities. We all have other commitments, personal and professional. But it's really important to show the people that we care, that we're going to fight on whatever the result, whether you're in the position or you're not. Baltimore is an amazing city. And right now, nothing is working.
Is that why you continue to participate and continue? I've seen you out at community events. I know that a lot of people have been out at community events voicing their frustration and concerns. Do you think that's important to continue to be out there and show up for the people even when leaders in City Hall are not?
Yes, emphatically yes. And it's because it shouldn't be about your own pride. When you lose an election, it hurts, right? You're bruised. And it's easy to want to retreat. But if you really are in it for the right reasons, if it's really about the city and about yourself, then no matter the result of the election, you got to keep showing up. You got to keep picking up the trash. You got to keep talking about the crime. You got to keep fighting for the schools. You got to try to make sure that the future for our children is better than what we have right now.
And Kim, when it comes to crime, obviously Mayor Scott has said that it's a partnership, and there are a lot of partnerships that are happening between the state, local, and federal level. Looking at your role as a former candidate running for Congress, how do you see your position working in Congress to help bring resources and usher those resources to really try and drive a change when it comes to crime and drive that crime rate down in the city?
That's a great question. So as you can see, Congressman Kweisi Mfume is also not here. And I asked anybody in the audience to please tell me where he's been lately, because I have no idea myself. But this is a federal level leader who has not shown up ever. And if you have the police commissioner, Commissioner Harrison, saying time and time again that he would love to get some federal resources to get more police on the streets. We're down 300 police officers on patrol. Where is Kweisi Mfume to make that call? He is a federal leader. We have the money to put into this, yet we've got now Governor Hogan trying to put more money, refunding the police. But Kweisi Mfume could do all of these things. He could have done that. He's been sworn in since May 5th of 2020. He won the special election. He won the general election, and he has not shown up since. There are people dying on the streets. There's a lot of blood on the streets, and in the neighborhoods where he supposedly represents, Carrollton Ridge, Sandtown, all of those areas that he has ignored time and time again. And I just hope, I pray, people vote differently next time around, and I will not leave. I will continue to be here time and time again.
You mentioned Governor Hogan's plan, the refund the police plan that he announced last week. Baltimore City, in fact, the mayor added more money. He increased the police budget, but we're also seeing this narrative from some elected leaders, especially in City Hall, who have been calling for the abolishment of the Baltimore Police Department. Do you think that hurts the efforts to save lives in the city when we're having elected leaders say such comments?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and say his name, Councilman Ryan Dorsey. How dare you say that you should abolish the police? Because I know, I watch his Twitter account where he has called the police himself numerous times. When he has people speeding outside of his house because he only wants bike lanes, he calls the police. So at the same time, he wants to be an activist, but I have to remind him, he is a city councilman, and he has to do his job. There are laws in place. Instead of focusing on bike lanes and plastic bags and all of these things that do not matter, they have to start doing something. Abolishing the police is not the thing to do.
Claudia, when it comes to policing, we saw that there was obviously a need for an increased police presence in Fells Point. That happened over the summer when there was an influx of violence. But you also said many times that you wanted to see the laws on the books just being enforced. Do you think that that's happening right now?
Look, I think we have a police force that has been handicapped by this administration and by our leadership. And it shows. When we were requesting, well, actually begging and crying for help in Fells Point, given what was going on, we were simply asking for basic infrastructure, basic laws. There was a sense of lawlessness that unfortunately continues across our city, not just in areas like Fells Point. Today, unfortunately, I heard of a crime that happened in Butcher's Hill. That was unbelievable. What can we possibly do if we have leaders who are speaking this narrative and refusing to allow the force to actually do their job? Basic, functional aspects of their job to ensure that we don't rise to the level of lawlessness that we're seeing.
Do you think that the city state's attorney's prosecution policies plays a role in that conversation?
There's absolutely no way that does not play a role in our environment, right? When we have Marilyn Mosby say that they won't be enforcing, certain laws. I'm sorry, there's I can't really.
Sorry.
When we have our Marilyn Mosby saying they're not going to be enforcing laws, of course, that creates a culture of lawlessness. It's not rocket science. Look, we're not asking for some police state. We're asking for this lawlessness and this culture to be extinguished by leadership, to acknowledge the role that law enforcement has, a positive role, and to create resources for citizens to be able to feel safe.
Do you think that city council plays a role in that? I know that they often say that Baltimore Police Department is not a city agency. They say that it's a state agency. But at the end of the day, the city council still approves the budget. The mayor has a say when it comes to the police commissioner. Do you think they can hide behind those comments and that narrative when they do have so much control?
Not only do they have so much power and authority over the budget, over the direction of the police department, they literally campaign on it when they're running for office. They say, I'm running for city council to reduce crime, and then they get in office and say, it's not my job, it's someone else's job. The irony of that is so lost upon them. But let's be really concrete about Governor Hogan's plan. Governor Hogan is a Republican governor, and it seems like every Democrat in the city council has decided if a Republican says it, we have to disagree. There's a rule that says we have to disagree. There are Democrats and Republicans on this stage. There are any number of issues where we have to agree to disagree. But in a democracy, you try to work together. And if Governor Hogan says we're sending $150 million of additional resources to train the police, to recruit the police, to get body cameras on police officers, what are they objecting to? They should be appreciative of that. They should be partnering with the governor. But instead, their knee-jerk political reaction is a Republican said it, so I've got to object. That's not democracy. That's city politics.
Pastor Wright, do you think that policing and law enforcement and public safety is a partisan issue?
Absolutely not.
Shouldn't be.
A bullet coming in your direction doesn't care what color you are, how much money is in your pocket. Dr. Martin Luther King said a long time ago that he was looking forward to the day where folks were judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So I'm curious when leadership is going to be based on what's best for people instead of political parties. Because when you have one side of a conversation, you probably need some pills for it because you're probably talking to yourself. And in that echo chamber, you don't hear other possibilities, other trends of thought. And when you talk about Mayor Scott, bless his soul, in his crime plan and his philosophy that he's using, that he said the first 2 times didn't work, but he's sure the 3rd time is going to be the charm. There's a couple of things that are confusing. Number one, the increase in the police budget is interesting when last year, as city council president, he forced them to remove money from their budget. While they're under a consent decree and there are things that need to be funded, he said that it was the mayor's responsibility to ensure public safety. So I'm curious when the charter changed between last year and this year, because I missed that. There were 13 other ballot items on the ballot, but that wasn't one of them. So it's interesting to me that there aren't but so many more steps Mayor Scott could have taken at City Hall other than janitor. Yet he still doesn't seem to have a full understanding of his power and authority or the definition of leadership by telling you don't understand government because he doesn't have the power to call a meeting, a hearing. It's time for folk to tell the truth and shame the devil. Good leadership does not wait for the charter to say what they can do. Good leadership does what's in the best interest of the people that elected them. Period.
Pastor Ray, you're referring to when I asked him if he would call a hearing about the city schools. This was after the Augusta Fells investigation that came out. The mayor said he didn't have the authority to. The charter did say that he does have the authority to call a special hearing of city council if he so chooses and if he deems it necessary. And so far that has
He has not deemed it necessary. You know, I appreciate the fact that Mayor Scott, I read somewhere, had left town for a little bit to go and take a leadership class. She would have done that before he got sworn in. But, you know, better late than never. I'm hoping that Baltimore City will not have 3 years of his class experiment, that he will actually either find the skill set or the individuals to be able to lead this city. Baltimore does not have time to continue down the rabbit hole. Shrinking population, broken schools, companies leaving, jobs leaving, crime rising. That's not an opinion, that's fact.
Thank you for that. Part of these town halls is to hear from the constituents, the people who live in Baltimore who come out and voice their concerns. I want to bring in my colleague, Fox 45 News, Riel Creighton. She's standing by talking to some of the people who have joined this discussion tonight. Riel, tell us who you're joined with and what you're hearing this evening.
Well, Mackenzie, I'm with Zulika Bazemore. She's a face that may be familiar to some people. She's long been a homeless advocate, a school choice advocate, and she's actually working on a plan she thinks will actually make a difference. And she did want the panel to weigh in on that. I'll let you ask your question.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you. My question actually is for Kimberly Klasick, because Kimberly, you did run for a federal position, a state position, but that would actually represent us in Washington, D.C. And so my question to you is, and I see you're still involved, so you care. So my question to you is, I would like to bring forth a proposition on the next general election that gives us, the citizens, the right to vote our school board elected officials in office so that we, the people, can hold our Board of Education accountable. And so what say you? Is that something that you think we can actually get pushed through? And if not, I'm running for the 40th district for House of Delegates, so I'm going to make sure we go to Annapolis to try to get that actually done.
Yeah, just so people understand, in case they don't know, here in Baltimore City, and this is unique to Baltimore because not many cities are like this, here in Baltimore City, your mayor actually appoints who's on the school board. And if you guys recall, remember that time where there was no heat in the schools and it was a national headline, and that's when Mayor Catherine Pugh decided that she was going to do something about it? Well, what she did is she actually added seats to the school board instead of going in and saying, you know what, we need to make some changes here. She just added 4 more friends. So yes, I definitely agree with that. Mayor Brandon Scott, to act like he has no control over this is just hilarious to me. He has all of the control. He could go down there to 200 North Avenue and really pull rank, but he decides not to. But yes, and I can't wait to support your run, by the way. Thank you so much for getting your hat in there.
Thank you, Kimberly. And thank you for caring enough about our city to just keep doing the work.
I appreciate that.
Kimberly, you mentioned the School Board of Commissioners, and I think that's important because that obviously has been a big topic for us as well, especially when it comes to some of the failures that have been uncovered in city schools. Next year, there will be 2 more board members who will become elected, but as you mentioned right now, Baltimore City is in fact the only jurisdiction in the entire state of Maryland that has appointed members to the board. Do you think that plays a role when it comes to Mayor Scott and his ability or willingness to really step in and get involved in some of these problems, and why do you think he continues to abdicate his responsibility?
I mean, I'm going to be just as honest as I can be right now. If you guys look at the FEC reports or the donors for Mayor Brandon Scott, Mayor Catherine Pugh, State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, you look at all their donors. They are all the same people. So they are going to continue to do what those same donors ask them to do time and time again. And that's what, when I talk about one-party mob rule, that's what it is. Those donors are controlling what's going on in this city. And he has to answer to them. If you guys notice, Mayor Brandon Scott, he was on quarantine because he had COVID-19. Of course, we give him nothing but well wishes. But at that time, he took the time to post on his social media that he was at home playing Nintendo. There's a lot going on in the city that you can even do from home, right? Because then they were working from home during the pandemic to begin with. But you sat there and you're playing video games while people are still dying in the streets and kids are not being educated. And that shows just how much he does not care about what's going on in Baltimore.
Claudia, we continue to hear politicians say that the city schools, it's a money problem, and we know that city schools is one of the highest funded school districts across the country, especially when it comes to the largest school districts in the country. more money's coming after Kerwin is implemented next year, but we continue to hear the same thing. Do you think people in the city are getting tired of hearing the excuses, especially when it comes to city leaders saying all the things they can't do? What can they do?
Well, there's a lot that they can do, as other panelists have mentioned here. I think, unfortunately, it is the same song, just a different theme. Here it's schools, there it's crime, here it's attracting and retaining businesses, enforcing laws. We can blame those folks in the institution. Absolutely. There's an accountability factor that is lacking, but we are all at fault here. If we do exactly what we've been doing, which is voting the same people in, career politicians who are looking at their next move, we're going to get the same results. Donors are the same, their aspirations are the same, the next office. Unfortunately, I personally am exhausted, and so are many neighbors, and so are so many people who are leaving the city. I mean, what were the numbers of the census data? They're drastic. How are we going to reverse that? We need better schools. We need people to feel safe. And we're not going to get that if we do not hold our elected officials accountable. The elections are too far away to make that kind of change today, but we need that change now. And the only way we're going to do that is if we hold them accountable and continue to have these conversations and calling them out on what they can do versus what they are not doing.
And Mackenzie, we're now down to 585,000 people. We are smaller today in Baltimore than we were in 1920, 100 years ago. And people are leaving for reasons that we can understand. The taxes are twice as high in Baltimore City as they are in the surrounding counties. The schools are 100th as good as they are in the county, and the crime here is out of control. It's hard to justify begging families to come into a city to pay high taxes for broken schools and record crime. It doesn't make any sense. But I do think it's important for us to have a nuanced debate about some of these hard questions. Look, we could elect our school board, and then we might end up with the same thing we have in city council. It's not like we're great at electing the best people here in Baltimore City, so that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. What we do have in a partially elected school board and a partially appointed school board is we know who to pin responsibility on. If you run on the campaign promise that you're going to reduce crime, fix the schools, get our economy working again, you can't get into office and then say, I don't have power over any of those things. That doesn't make any sense.
I have to cut you off really quickly because this concludes our broadcast version of this. Thank you so much for joining us. Our conversation continues. Just head to foxbaltimore.com. We're not done. We're really just getting started. We'll see you online.
Oh, I forgot this was live.
All right. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We continue this conversation, and I want to go back to you because you said that we could end up in the same situation where we're seeing this apathy in City Hall, and that could translate over to North Avenue when it comes to city schools. But what about the idea of implementing a recall system? Could that apply for City Hall as well as the school board?
Look, the threat of a recall is a real instrument that could really get your leaders to get into action. But the threat of an election ought to be able to do the same thing. You're right. There's going to be some buyer's remorse when you elect a new fleet of people who run on the promise and pledge that they're going to change things and then nothing changes. We're frustrated. But this is the first time I've ever seen in the history of Baltimore this level of engagement this far out. Yep. We haven't had town halls every 2 weeks in every district. We haven't had this relentless level of coverage by our local media. We haven't had panelists and people claiming that they're going to run for office this early. That's a level of vigilance that Baltimore desperately needs, and now might be the time to build upon that momentum. I'm optimistic that democracies do work, that the people are not too stupid to elect the right people. We've just got to educate one another about the policy decisions we're making, and I think every time we have one of these conversations, we're a little bit closer to doing that.
I think we also need to remind the voters that they have more power than they realize. Right now, if you're interested in really making change, you don't have to wait till the next election cycle to elect somebody new. Matter of fact, I challenge you all now. Go to urbanengage.org, scroll down the page, look at the Take Back Our Schools icon, click what you want to work on. There are several things that can be done right now. One, recall. That is definitely a good option, but you need to pair that with term limits on the ballot side for the local and the city. And then from the legislative side, we need a dissolution of the current school board and a completely elected school board, as well as introduction of legislation so that the money follows the student, to introduce competition in the schools. You can't keep putting a classroom together where there's more four-legged critters than two-legged students and expect that you're still going to be one of the highest paid school districts. The chancellor of schools here in the city, pardon me, superintendent of schools, makes $20,000 a year less than the New York City chancellor of schools. They got a lot more students, a lot more schools, and their graduation rates and their SAT scores and all the other metrics are a heck of a lot higher. So can anybody explain to me why logically Dr. Santelises is still here other than nepotism, or maybe she's got some dirt on somebody? Because the balloon payment to pay her off could have been paid with the GO students' tuition from Augusta Fells.
You mentioned the CEO of City Schools, Dr. Sonia Santelises. We've asked several of our viewers multiple times in some of our polling that we do throughout our newscast if people think that she should be fired or should City Council ask questions. We saw during the second City Schools investigative hearing, if you can call it an investigative hearing, into some of the GO students that happened at Augusta Fells. They never asked about what was being, they never mentioned Augusta Fells, and only one council member asked about GO students one time. Do you think that's really the best route and the best use of the City Council's time to hold these hearings if none of those questions are ever going to be asked?
Absolutely not. That report that you're speaking of, Reimagine, Pixie Dust, whatever it was they wanted to call it, was 53 pages. It wasn't until the 27th page that they got beyond the Captain Obvious statements and actually got into what they were going to do. The first half of the report said who they talked to and what they asked. And quite frankly, if you need an advanced degree to know that you need to have support services and wraparound services, you need not be the CEO of schools here in the city. This is not rocket science. It's common sense, and it's actually doing what you're hired to do. When you look at that report, if you read it, it sounds great on paper. They talked about COVID mitigation and how they were going to keep the schools safe. And the plan on paper is awesome, but they're not implementing the plan. See, we have a smoke and mirrors kind of shell game thing in Baltimore. We write down what we think people want to hear, and then we do what we want to do. You can't tell me you have a mitigation plan that is regionally and nationally recognized for having nurses in the buildings and social workers to help with the stress of students returning to school after so long when you don't actually have nurses in the buildings or social workers. Who's doing it?
Look, I think it's important to recognize that our schools have literally never been worse. There are dozens of schools that don't have heat or air conditioning. Student performance is at an all-time low. Morale among teachers and principals is plummeting. It literally is as bad as it's ever gotten. But it wasn't always that way. My dad, and we have to remind ourselves about the promise of these schools. My dad and mom are here in the audience. They're in their 80s. They came out because I'm on stage. But they care about this city because they spent their lives devoted to this city. My dad taught at Douglas High School. Frederick Douglass High School is where Thurgood Marshall went to school. My mom taught at Poly High School in 1970. Poly High School wasn't the pride of Baltimore. It wasn't the pride of Maryland. It was the pride of the nation. She crossed an ocean to have the privilege of teaching at Poly High School. Now, every parent that can afford to is pulling their kids out of these public schools and moving to the county or finding a private school that'll educate them the way they deserve.
What do you think happened?
Look, it was a combination of two things. One is that one year after another, our elected officials contributed to the culture of low expectations. We had low expectations of our students. We had low expectations of our teachers. The trend of creating students as GO students, of increasing grades, that pressure was there when my mom and dad were teaching, but they resisted it. Now it's part of the norm. It's part of the culture that we pass kids that are not ready to go on. These kids are starting not ready for kindergarten. Half of our girls and 2/3 of our boys fail the kindergarten readiness assessment test. They're already a mile behind, and then it gets worse year after year.
We know that the national report card that comes out, they tested some of the schools and the students in 2019, and it showed that in 8th grade, students did worse in math than they did in 4th grade. So the longer they were in city schools, the worse their testing and at least their math skills were doing. Kim, we know that city schools gets some federal funding. Do you think that there's a congressional role, a congressional oversight role here that should be talked about when it comes to auditing or some of the, where is this money going that we know that these city schools are getting?
Yes, if Congressman Kwesi Nfume wanted to come out and do his job, he can do just that. It's unfortunate because right now, Baltimore City high school students, 41% has a 1.0 GPA or lower. That is abysmal. That is child abuse. That is child neglect. It should never get that way. But I have to say, you know, we can do a lot from the federal level. I don't know, I just wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about the fact that I ran on bringing career opportunities to Baltimore, where there is workforce development for those coming out right out of high school, those that want to go and do trade. That's what I was running on. Right now we see the supply chain issue across this country. Why haven't we done this in the past? Why not do more with the Baltimore City Port that's right here in our backyard? We could have even brought it back to Baltimore, the big billion-dollar medical equipment industry, back to Baltimore during the pandemic when we were relying on other countries for PPE. We could have done that. People wanted to open up warehouses here in Baltimore City that I spoke to, and they were wondering, could they do that? Am I going to get in office? And they could do on-the-job training, paid training. And these are all the things that people talked about. They do not have careers. So the school system, yes, it is terrible. But when you get out of school and there is no job, where do we expect anybody to go? What do we expect anyone to do? And, you know, just to add on to that, Allstate was willing to do a behind-the-wheel training for truck drivers, $2,000 a pop. What do we have a shortage in right now in the national level? Truck drivers. They could have been living right here in Baltimore City and doing something about the supply chain issue and making all that money.
Career readiness, I know that there's obviously college is not for every student, and that's fine. There's a lot of other opportunities out there after high school. Claudia, when it comes to the city council's role in this, there's only so much that can be done federally at the state level and so on, but the city council plays a role in this as well. What do you think the elected leaders at the local level could be doing?
We talk about partnering with the private sector. I mean, it's a no-brainer. People need employees. There is a scarcity of employees. There is a scarcity of trade here. We have hotels, we have restaurants who don't have people who A, have the skill set, and B, understand the opportunities for growth within that industry. We have retailers who are struggling. The National Retail Federation has a program that we could bring to Baltimore. If only we were able to talk to one another and understand the needs that the private sector has and the public sector doesn't understand, we could bridge those and create opportunities for our communities. Retail, service industry, trades, there are tons of opportunities, but we refuse to engage in meaningful relationships with the private sector, and this is where we are. We don't have those opportunities for our communities because we don't engage with the private sector in productive conversations, partly because our leaders don't show up.
I want to come back to this, but first let's go back to Riel, talking to those people who have shown up to participate in this conversation tonight. Riel, tell us who you have again, and another question for our panelists.
And Mackenzie, one of those people tonight is actually Roya Hanna. She's currently a criminal defense attorney, but she was a former assistant state's attorney for more than a decade. She actually quit under Marilyn Mosby. She's currently, again, a criminal defense attorney, but you had some questions related to juvenile crime.
Yes. In recent months, we've seen a lot of juveniles, both who have been killed and have juveniles who have done the killing. So I guess my question for the panel is, what do you think the effect of our leaders failing to address both the educational system and the public safety system is having on our kids, and what structural changes would they make?
Drew, why don't you take that question?
Yeah, look, I mentioned Frederick Douglass High School earlier. If you go to Douglass, on the wall of Douglass High School, we got some Douglass alum here. There's a quote from 1855. It is easier to raise strong children than to repair broken men. Yeah. It is as true today as it was 5 years before the American Civil War. We realized back then the question, which is the connection between the schools and crime. If we don't get these kids an education, we know they're going to end up turning to gangs for jobs. If we don't get these folks some jobs, we know they're going to turn to the streets for money. We know that they're connected. So what do we need to do? We, of course, need to reform our schools. We, of course, need to reform our juvenile justice system. And there's a long conversation about those things. But I want to notice more broadly that we're having this conversation, but our elected officials aren't here. That's a problem because there are Democrats and Republicans that are up here. There are some issues that we've disagreed about, but we've done it respectfully. We've done it constructively. This is a conversation I promised you that if any of us got elected in office, even once we were in office, we would return to the stage and have that conversation. Until our elected officials don't try to choose what questions they're asked, don't try to choose what outlets they respond to, we're not going to have a constructive dialogue here in Baltimore. And be clear, this is not about Democrats versus Republicans. This is not about FOX45 or the Baltimore Brew. Johnny O, a Democrat in Baltimore County, answers questions from FOX45. Calvin Ball in Howard County, Stuart Pittman in Anne Arundel County, they go and answer the questions. The only politicians in the state of Maryland that don't show up and answer questions are Baltimore City politicians. I don't understand it.
Well, it creates a divide, right? It allows them to stay in power. If they're not communicating, they're not answering those hard questions, and they can just deflect and pretend like that's not part of their job, that's why they're still here. And we have the power, all of us here, to hold them accountable, and that needs to continue.
You mentioned that we know that the city leaders aren't here. If you're just joining us, we invited Mayor Brandon Scott. We invited City Council President Nick Mosby. We invited the entire City Council, city school leaders, City School Board of Commissioners, and everyone has declined and refused to participate in tonight's town hall. That's why they are not here. They did not want to be here and talk about this. You also mentioned that they don't answer some of our questions. I went back and looked, and since March, I had sent City Council members a series of emails asking specifically about city schools, especially after the Augusta Fells investigation. And I asked 99 questions to the city council, the mayor, and the city council president. 99 questions, and almost all of them, I would say 90% of those questions, have gone ignored from our city leaders. When it comes to getting any sort of results, if the leadership doesn't change, do you think the results in Baltimore City will ever?
They can. It's up to the voters. You don't need to sit back. You ever watch the classic where the little boy Blue, sitting there and he says, "Please, sir, may I have some more?" How long are you going to continue to stand there with your hand out and beg for somebody to give you something that it's yours to have in the first place? Why do you have to beg for decent schools? Why do we have to beg for safe streets? They don't beg for us to continue to pay our taxes. So why do we have to beg? The answer is we don't. But folks here, folks watching, folks listening need to understand they have a role, a right, and a responsibility to take that power back. It's well within their grasp to do so. You don't have to wait for City Council to decide to actually hold the Board of Commissioners for Schools responsible. You can write to your state folk and support legislation to be able to change, to make sure the whole board is dissolved and there's a completely elected school board. You don't need anybody in that building's permission to do that. Enough folks have to decide that they are tired and ready to be a part of the solution. You know, when you talk about jobs and you talk about vocational and trades, and Ms. Klasick was quite correct, that's a lucrative way for folks to be able to pay their bills, but it's not sexy. The folks in the trades aren't the ones on the donation reports, so they're not going to get that kind of attention. Folks need to understand, when we're out here and we're talking about the schools all the time, it's not just because we have nothing better to talk about. When you look at, I don't know how do I put this? So there are a lot of things that are dependent on school proficiency scores. One thing is prison cells. Folks look at proficiency scores in the 4th and again in the 8th grade to predict from trends how many prison cells they need to have ready. So when we allow these city leaders to fail our children in school, we are opening the door and say, here, please take them to prison. That's what happens. Classroom, prison, pipeline.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you think there really is a classroom to courtroom pipeline happening in Baltimore City right now?
You know, right now, what we see is the breakdown in the juvenile justice system and the breakdown in the school system, resulting in violent repeat offenders reoffending day after day. They are becoming victims and they are becoming perpetrators. They are on the streets as squeegee boys, and they become victims of addiction and victims of homelessness. These are cycles that we all know about. And here's a question for the audience. Is there a single thing in Baltimore that's working right now? Is there a single policy, a single thing that you can shout out? Lamar Jackson is something we can all take pride in. Is there anything else in Baltimore that we can, anything? The schools, the trash isn't getting picked up. The people are leaving. The schools are broken. The taxes are high. The crime is out of control. Nothing small or big is working. And that's frankly part of the reason why your city officials aren't here, because why on earth would they come and try to defend that record?
But I want to ask you this because we often hear that city council and city leaders are well known in their community. Based on what you're hearing from some constituents, do you think, whether or not they're well known is besides the point, but do you think the city should trust those city leaders based on their current performance and past performance?
I don't know why you would. They're not showing up to conversations that are important, that could create change and opportunity for our communities. Why would you trust that? There's no reason to. It's not just that they don't show up. It's that they don't engage, that they don't respond to constituency requests. Their constituents feel, in some cases, like they're not represented. I know personally I feel that way. I don't understand how we can possibly trust elected officials who are not holding themselves accountable to their constituents. You literally were elected by these people. Whether you agree or disagree, you should engage. You should listen. You should take time to create opportunities, and you should also relish the opportunity to come here. And I disagree. I think they should be here. They should want to be here. They should want to hear what the issues are. It's not an easy job, and it's not a popularity contest while you're doing the job. Maybe while you're running for office, you have to be popular. But when you're doing the job, you need to make hard decisions. You need to not, if everyone loves you all the time, you're not pushing enough. You're not doing enough. And that's where we are. I don't feel like we're doing enough. Our leadership is not doing enough. They're not listening and they're not showing up.
You also, I want to ask you about something when it comes to being a small business owner, because there's a lot of things that city council can do to help with. You mentioned, one of the panelists mentioned high taxes. Do you think the city council could be doing more to make Baltimore City a more business friendly that could attract more people, increase the population, increase the tax base, and overall improve the city?
Let's talk about culture. Just the basic culture and respect towards people who put their livelihoods at risk every single day as small business owners in this city. Just a basic level of respect towards those people by showing up, by answering their questions, by helping them find resources. Look, there's no one person who will resolve all the issues of Baltimore City, but if you don't even try, if you don't even show up, if you don't even speak to people, how can you possibly be effective?
I want to ask you about when it comes to working with the federal partnerships, because as a former federal prosecutor, what could be done more to strengthen that relationship and help improve crime, help improve some of these problems that we're seeing? Because a lot of it does come back to education and crime. That's why a lot of people are leaving the city.
Yeah, look, we know that the U.S. Attorney's Office is supposed to be working with the state's attorney's office. We know federal agents are supposed to be working with local agents. But if the city's systems are not working at all, there's only so much that our federal partners can do. And let's be really concrete about this. When Governor Hogan says we're going to provide $150 million to help recruit and retain and train better and more police officers, that's not just some abstract theory. There's a concrete consequence to that. In Baltimore City, there's about 40 to 45 homicide detectives for 300 plus murders. That's one detective for every 8 to 9 homicides. In Baltimore County, it's one detective for every 3 homicides. Guess what? In Baltimore County, they solve 70, 80, 90% of the homicides. In Baltimore City, we solve 20 or 30 or 40%. We need those cops. Cops are not the enemy. Some of them have done unconscionable things. They ought to be condemned and prosecuted and called out for them dishonoring the badge. But the rest of them are putting their lives on the line at a time when it's not particularly fashionable to be a police officer and going into the most dangerous city in America and doing good work. We should commend them and support them too.
We hear the consent decree used a lot when it comes to hamstringing some of the Baltimore Police Department and their officers. Do you think that really is part of the problem?
You know, this is something that I might disagree with my panelists on. My view is that the consent decree is not the thing to blame any more than the judges are to blame. In 2015 and 2016, we had 300 plus murders. In 2017 and 2018, we had 300 plus murders. Well, the consent decree was in place for 2016 and 17, but not the previous years. Before the consent decree, after the consent decree, we still had 300 plus murders. It's easy to blame the consent decree because the consent decree can't argue back. But it's really the ineffectiveness of our police department and our prosecutors and our city leaders that explains why crime is so high.
When we have to go to reality. I see she has another member of the audience who has a question, but when we come back, I want to bring up the Inspector General and the role of transparency and accountability for members inside City Hall. But Riel, I see you are joined with another audience member with another question. What are you hearing?
And Mackenzie, I'm joined by Bill Gooden. He's a citizen who's actually been so frustrated by what he's seeing that he's actually planning to march on this building right here that is behind us, and it has to do with this building behind us.
Absolutely. First, let me just thank 45 and the citizens for being out here. But my question is this. Why is it everything else is open? Stadiums, schools, everything. But you can't go in City Hall. You have to make an appointment to MVA. And they tell you it's because of COVID. And you go right around the corner to the strip club. And they open, but they locking us out of what we pay our taxes for.
Strip club. Claudia, why don't you take that question? Because I know that City Hall still is closed. I've asked the mayor, I've asked City Council presidents several times when it will reopen. They continue to say it's a COVID and it's a pandemic problem. Do you think City Hall should be open to the public?
You know, I don't understand how they can sit there and say that it is because of the pandemic that they are not open when basically Maryland is open and Baltimore City is open. I think it serves as a perfect excuse to just perpetuate this culture of not showing up, of disengagement and unaccountability.
And they're supposedly all vaccinated. So again, it doesn't make any sense.
And I don't think people appreciate the importance of Bill's point. We send our teachers into the schools. We send our sanitation workers into the streets. We send all sorts of people that work for the city into their work to do the work, except for the ones that we elect. It makes literally no sense that they exempt themselves from having to do the same things that all of our other city workers are doing every day.
So interestingly enough, they could take this beautiful field right here where we're sitting and put up some tents if they're so worried about COVID and conduct office hours outdoors. It's an interesting concept. Most of us have been doing that for about a year or two now. So the building itself being closed is an excuse to not be able to answer questions, to not have to look at taxpayers, to still take your money, but not have to be able to talk to you, answer questions, or any of your concerns or complaints about the services you're not getting for the money you're still paying. But if the city leaders really gave a rat's butt about the people in the city, they would be outdoors. If they can go outdoors for the conference, the counties, and down the shore and have crabs, and they can go to the Ravens games, they sure can put up some tents and chairs and have outdoor sessions and make appointments if that makes them feel better, but handle the people's business right here.
When it comes to City Hall, I want to talk about the Inspector General. It's the first independent office of the Inspector General in Baltimore City's history. There's some debate and some issues right now when it comes to the oversight panel and the members who are sitting on that oversight panel. The Inspector General has said that she wants this oversight panel. It's part of the charter that was passed and approved by voters, but it's not in best practices to have people who could potentially be involved in investigations from her office sitting on this oversight panel.
So in other words, we have so much corruption, we have to bring in somebody to actually watch people to try and keep them from being corrupt. And then the people that seem to be the class of corrupt get to watch over the person they brought in to make sure they're not corrupt. That's how that's supposed to work?
Do you think it's an effective way to operate an Inspector General who has its role is to root out fraud, waste, and abuse?
No. She needs to have the autonomy to be able to look at what she needs to look at, ask the questions she needs to ask, because obviously none of us are getting any answers. So she needs to be able to do that. She is our only hope.
What's really remarkable is how supportive City Council and the mayor were of Isabel Cummings and the Inspector General when she wasn't actually calling them out. And then as soon as they started getting called out, immediately they needed oversight. The people that were being investigated needed to be on the oversight committee. Isabel Cummings and the Inspector General's office does a critical function, which is a watchdog over City Hall. Why would you need to be the watchdog over the watchdog that is trying to do it? It doesn't make any sense. And I think the hypocrisy of saying they support that office, they want more dollars to that office, and then as soon as she starts publicly calling them out for the waste, fraud, inefficiency, incompetence, ineptitude, suddenly they're whistling a different tune.
Because the expectation was that she would go along the way things had been functioning.
Claudia, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to weigh in on this conversation?
I just couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Say it out loud again, through the oversight of the oversight. How is that possible? How does that make any sense? And unfortunately, again, nothing will change if we don't hold them accountable. If we, the citizens of Baltimore, do not speak up and say this is not okay.
And I wanted to add, too, I mean, a lot of federal dollars is also coming into Baltimore City. And Congressman Kwesi Mfume could follow the money on his hand as well. He could also, yes, he could also provide oversight himself, but he chooses not to. And like, you know, this one-party mob rule, I know Democrats and Republicans, we get along, but at the end of the day, you know, Democrats have been running the city for 53 years, and I'm not saying that Democrats are bad people. What I'm saying is when you continue to elect friends of friends, corruption like this happens, and sometimes you got to get different people in there.
I want to ask this. Do you think Baltimore City would be better off or worse off if the Inspector General was no longer independent and if she was no longer able to do these investigations based on tips and complaints filed from the people of Baltimore?
When I asked the question, is there anything working in Baltimore City right now, besides Lamar Jackson, the one answer that I would have accepted was Isabel Cummings in the Inspector General's office, because she actually is, one week after another, issuing reports that point out fraud, corruption, inefficiency, and ineptitude. That office ought to be given $5 million and be 10 times as big as it is, because it is rooting out corruption. It's calling people out. To have that be the office that they're worried about, that needs oversight, it makes literally no sense to me. I think this is one of those moments where we have to recognize that our elected officials are just not getting the job done. And we have to decide what kind of conversation we have. We've been respectful. We're not trying to be mean. We're not trying to be mean-spirited. They often are rude when they get asked hard questions. None of us have been rude. We've all been asked hard questions before, but it's time now to come together as a city and say enough is enough.
That's a great place to end and wrap up our evening. An hour went by extremely fast. Thank you to our panelists for a great conversation, and thank you to all of our audience members who came out tonight to ask some questions and participate in this dialogue. The point of these town halls is to hear from you, the people of Baltimore. Voice your concerns. We know that our elected leaders have refused to participate in these discussions, but we will not stop hosting these town halls. Hopefully the elected leaders will decide to participate and listen to the people who put them in office and hear what those concerns are. Until our next town hall, thanks for joining us and have a great night.
I'm Dan Miller.
I'm Kevin Stern. At Miller Stern Lawyers, we are honored to serve the community that we love. We work for you.
For over a decade, we've spent our days and nights fighting for you. We believe in justice. We believe in fighting for what's right.
That's why we are proud to sponsor a community conversation to make a better Baltimore.
It takes guts to stand up for justice and accountability and demand better.
And we can do it by giving you a voice in your future.
At Miller Stern, we're fighting for a better Baltimore.
My name is Linda Batts.
You had a question related to accountability about the American Rescue Plan funding.
Absolutely. We have a